Hello, everybody, and welcome to The Right Take. This is episode number 4. I'm Eric Lendrum.
I'm Jacob Grandstaff.
And I'd say things are going pretty well for us thus far, Jacob. Although we did have a little bit of a social media setback recently. Jacob and I are no longer on Twitter as of the recording of this episode. Jacob, you made the decision, correct me if I'm wrong, to delete your account, right?
Correct. I deleted my account, not necessarily as a boycott, but because Twitter was taking away followers. So if you work hard to build up a following, I had about, I would say in about 9,000, a little over 9, I had about 9,200 followers at the beginning of September.
Over 9,000!
And they brought that down. Twitter subtracted, I want to say roughly 4,500 by the beginning of January. So at that point, and also I wasn't getting any traction. So it's like, what is the point of being on Twitter if Twitter doesn't want you there? Like, you don't want to go. You don't want to go to a restaurant if the people don't want you there.
Yeah, I myself was closing in on 900 followers. They nuked about 80 of my followers. I totally get the point you're saying. If they don't want you there, why be there? But I'm going to be that kind of guy. Like with the mask thing. If I go into a place other than a restaurant, because I understand restaurants, if I go into a place like a post office where they're going to harass me for not wearing a mask, I'm going to stand my ground and make them kick me out. I'm that kind of person. That would be me. And I feel the same way about Twitter. So I did everything I could to make sure they banned me. I was tweeting, Trump did nothing wrong. And I kept going and kept going. And eventually they just banned me in the night. They never sent me an email letting me know which tweet it was. Nothing. Just boom, I'm suspended. And so I fell on the field of battle, and we are both off Twitter one way or another. So we decided to nix the Right Take podcast Twitter account. That is gone. Don't worry about that. It's not like we could gain much from that from anything. This is the most toxic platform in the history of the internet, in my humble opinion. And it's my understanding that Parler is back, or it's coming back. But for the time being, we are no longer on Twitter, and we'll be back on Parler probably if Parler ever does eventually come back. But despite those setbacks, I think things are going really, really well. But, I think even though things are going well, I think we can do even better, Jacob. And you know how I think we can really improve things here? It's interesting. We were talking offline the other day, Jacob, and you made a comment about how this North Virginia area where we are now, Nova, as it's called, Arlington, Alexandria, you said it's more Manhattan than it is Virginia, right?
Yes.
I agree. So why don't we just drop the facade? Let's just forget the Manhattan of Virginia, and let's pack up and move our operations to Manhattan. Let's take the Big Apple. Because you know why? New York may be an absolute third world country right now. Crime rates through the roof. The coronavirus worse than ever. Businesses shuttered. People fleeing. All the good cops leaving the NYPD. But come next year in New York, they're going to start giving every citizen of the city a free $1,000 a month. That's right, ladies and gentlemen, because Andrew Yang has announced his candidacy for mayor of New York City. This is great. This is something that more niche political observers were keeping an eye on. For those of you who don't remember, Andrew Yang was one of the approximately 527 candidates who ran for the Democratic nomination for president of the United States last year. He was one of the earliest ones to jump in. He announced in 2017, so 2 years in advance. His big shtick was what he called the freedom dividend, which is a pretty cringe name, let's be honest. That's just a really, really cute way of saying universal basic income, of a free $1,000 a month to every single American citizen for doing nothing. Just boom, you get a free $1,000 a month. So that was his campaign, and he ran as a total internet guy, very much social media, kind of trying to emulate the meme success of President Trump's candidacy in 2016. And he eventually dropped out of that race, of course. He never had a chance. But he apparently has decided, hey, I can take my D-list presidential candidacy and translate that into running for mayor of the biggest city in the world. So let's see how this plays out. He is in a field with at least 20 other Democrat candidates for that nomination. A couple of polls show him at the top of that field by a very small plurality, but because it is so splintered. And whoever wins the Democrat nomination in that race is going to win the election. I'm sorry, no Republican is going to get elected mayor of New York City. So we'll keep an eye out and see if that yields any success. Best of luck, Andrew Yang, giving a free $1,000 a month to everybody in the city of New York, bankrupting even more so than it already has been. I'll say this much, though. As cringe as he is, and yeah, he's a Democrat, he's still a lefty, and has really stupid ideas and beliefs besides the UBI thing. he can't possibly be any worse than Bill de Blasio can. The only thing that could possibly be worse than Bill de Blasio is a literal Black Panther. That's the only other thing I can think of. Because I have friends in New York who tell me, oh yeah, all the progress done in the 90s, 2000s, and early 2010s by Giuliani and then Bloomberg, because Bloomberg was actually kind of decent on policing when he was mayor, all that progress has been completely erased under the 8 years of de Blasio. It's absolute. It's right back to where it was in the 70s and 80s, minus the mafia controlling the city, but still the high crime rates, the terrible economy, everything. So let's see if New York...
all the capital is fleeing. Everyone with money, they're getting out. They're moving to Connecticut.
Exactly. It's literally Escape from New York in real life, minus Kurt Russell coming to save the day. So, with that said, it's a total hellhole over in New York, but it's a total police state here in D.C. So kind of two sides of the same coin, right? I made an effort to try to go into the city over the weekend because I figured I've never seen a real police state before in real life. I want to check this out. And the government was like, nope, that is not happening. Every single metro station in the city of D.C. is completely shut down until Thursday, the day after the inauguration. But Jacob, I hear you managed to successfully venture into the police state that was once Washington, D.C.
So I was driving there a couple of days ago, and I knew that they were going to be locking everything down on election or on inauguration day. I had no idea that they were going to start shutting down streets and start setting up military checkpoints. This was 2 days ago, so this was almost a week in advance before the inauguration. So I had no idea that they were going to be setting up military checkpoints and stopping people, asking where you're going and everything. Why are you here? What are you doing? But that's exactly what they're doing in the downtown area. They have every single street, every single corner. They have military Humvees. They have anywhere from 5 to 10 National Guard troops out there with military grade weapons, loaded weapons, as if it's a military. You think we were Iraq or something. But I'll tell you, there is a silver lining about this. The National Mall is shut down on Inauguration Day. They announced that. I heard that on the radio, and the poor DJ, he was trying to cope as much as he could. And he basically, after he announced it, he basically gave the beta male version of, go check out our website. We posted some pictures of rainbows and puppy dogs to cheer you up. But the fact that but here's the thing. This is something that Democrats in Washington, D.C. have been looking forward to the entirety of Trump's presidency. They were looking forward to Inauguration Day 2021 because this was the day that 1 million people from around the country, 1 million liberal Democrats, are going to converge on D.C. and celebrate in the National Mall the end of the Trump presidency and finally the beginning of another, Obama 2.0. And they can't do it because, and you know why they can't do it? The reason they can't do it is because they legitimized political violence. And anytime you have political violence, any kind of violence, it could be a school shooting, whatever, you're always going to have copycats. And they didn't take into account that the fringe right would say, you know what, hey, if political violence works for the left, we're going to try it out too. So I don't know, maybe while they're on their sofa watching the inauguration, they can be thinking about the good times they could be having with their friends on Pennsylvania Avenue, celebrating with their fellow liberal Democrats the inauguration of Joe Biden, if only they had not legitimized political violence this past summer.
Yeah, and if nothing else, too, celebrating the end of the Trump presidency, they were so eager to have an argument about whose inauguration crowd size was bigger, but now it's no question.
Trump's will be bigger.
Trump's will be bigger. Oh, my goodness, because it's us not counting the 20,000 National Guardsmen who will be there. They don't count. They're there because they're forced to be there. The actual physical audience will be every member of Congress plus one special guest per member. So roughly 1,000 people. In other words, about 990 more people than an average Joe Biden rally would get.
Correct.
So, and Biden is going to be so mad. He's going to be so mad that he doesn't get a real inauguration.
What's insane is Biden had the FBI vet all 25,000 National Guard troops in D.C. because he's afraid that they're going to stage a coup. This is the most pathetic inauguration in the history of this country when the president-elect is so scared of the people. Allegedly he was elected by the people, but he's got to get 25,000 troops to protect him from the people.
He allegedly got more votes than any other president in history, and yet he needs the military to shut down his inauguration to protect it.
And he can't even trust that military. He's got to get the FBI to vet every single member to make sure they're not going to stage a coup and overthrow his inauguration. But it's just... These are interesting times we're living in, that's for sure.
Well, maybe he's onto something actually about the insiders in the National Guard who might attack from the inside. The terrorists already stationed in the National Guard. After all, there's that one photo circulating the internet of the National Guardswoman reading Ayn Rand.
Yeah,
So who knows?
I think it was Atlas Shrugged.
Yeah, Atlas Shrugged. It was literally Atlas Shrugged. So maybe Biden's onto something. I don't know.
I don't know. It's maybe this, if anything, hopefully this will give D.C. residents greater respect for the armed forces. I mean, that's if they really think that right-wing terrorists are that much of a threat, then maybe they'll at least view the military National Guard favorably as protecting them from the phantom menace of right-wing terrorism. But another thing that I've noticed is interesting is that you've got a lot more Democrats now that are finally starting to back the blue. So over the summertime, they jumped wholeheartedly. The upper middle class white suburbanites jumped wholeheartedly on the Black Lives Matter bandwagon. Obviously, not everybody, but a good portion of them. And at its heart, it was an anti-police movement. But then all of a sudden, when they see right-wingers fighting with the police, their sympathy suddenly goes out to the police. And it was interesting. I've heard this story about Officer Daniel Hodges with the Washington Metropolitan Police Department. So during the attack on the Capitol, as Trump supporters were rushing the Capitol, they were busting out windows and rushing the door. Officer Hodges got trapped between the other officers and the door, and he was crushed between. He was in a lot of pain. He was crushed. He ended up suffering a headache and other minor injuries. But this image in this video went viral, and just the outpouring of sympathy from the left toward this police officer and the MPD in general, I thought was very, very interesting. But I found something else that was interesting. I saw this interview in which Officer Hodges claimed that he was proud or pleased to crush a white nationalist insurrection. Eric, do you have that clip? You could play that clip for us.
If it wasn't my job, I would have done that for free. It was absolutely my pleasure to crush a white nationalist insurrection.
So I didn't watch the clip at first. I just read about it, that this is what he said. And I was thinking, okay, he was crushed between the Trump supporters and a door. He was injured. So I can see maybe him saying something like this in rage. I do hope that the Trump supporters who were responsible for his injury do go to jail. That's definitely inexcusable. But I figured maybe he just said this in rage. But then I watched the whole clip, and keep in mind, I was there, not at the Capitol siege, but I was at Trump's speech, so I saw a lot of the people, a lot of the different characters that were at this rally who ended up going and charging the Capitol. He actually accurately describes some of the people that are there. If you could back that clip up a little bit and play where he describes the people that they faced off against.
Just the cognitive dissonance and the zealotry of these people is unreal, because they were waving, the thin blue line flag while telling us that we're traitors and calling themselves patriots, and later on beating us with the flag. And I had one guy yelling at me, telling me that he paid for my gear for me to give it to him. We had alleged veterans telling us that they fought for their country, they would never hurt us, but at the same time they were there hurting us.
So Eric Munchell was the guy, the zip tie guy, who charged into the Capitol, into the Senate chamber. I think it was the Senate chamber, but the picture of him went viral. He had zip ties. He had what looked like military gear going on, and people assumed he was going in there to capture the congressman. Eric Munchell was identified because he was wearing a thin blue line on the Tennessee with the shape of the state of Tennessee, so that's how people were able to identify him. So it was interesting. He was wearing the thin blue line while breaking the law with a mob that was attacking police officers. So Officer Hodges is not wrong when he mentions that there was cognitive dissonance among these people, among the MAGA people who stormed the Capitol. They're waving the thin blue line, but yet they're attacking police officers. And he does describe there's a conspiratorial element. And I completely concur with everything he said, because I was there at the speech, and I definitely saw that. But then he jumps at the very end and he says, it was a pleasure to crush a white, and he kind of stutters, a white nationalist insurrection. Nothing that he said before that to describe what they faced has anything to do with white nationalism. And the thing is, this idea that there's a white nationalist element in society, nationalism indicates nationality. So you can be a German nationalist, a French nationalist, an American nationalist, an English nationalist. There is no ethnicity that's called white. There's no nationality to that. There's no nation to that nationality. So it's basically just a slur that the left has been using to attack anyone that's right of center. And look, I was there. Not everybody there was white. I mean, there were people there in the group I was with that were not white. There was a guy who wasn't white that offered to drive us to the Capitol when he found out there was siege in the Capitol. Like, no, we don't want anything to do with that. He was like, no, this is history. We got to go. He's like, hop in my car. He wasn't white. So the idea that this was an all-white crowd and they're white nationalists, it doesn't make any sense. And honestly, I understand, I understand the joke about police officers being drawn from the bottom of the IQ barrel, but I honestly don't believe that this officer is this stupid. If you watch that clip, if you go to YouTube and you watch that clip, it's pretty obvious this is set up. It's scripted. He was told to attack white nationalism because here's the thing with the Biden administration, Black Lives Matter is problematic with the Biden administration. The police, although they're at the very bottom of the authority structure, whenever you have a movement like BLM that's attacking the police and you have a Republican in office, it can create chaos and it can create an opening for Democrats. If Biden is president and BLM is attacking the police and hating the police, this is kind of a problem because it creates unrest. So this is, I feel like this was where they're trying to tell the audience, no, look, this guy, even though it's a white cop, he enjoys beating up white nationalists. Like he's on your side, he's against white nationalists. So I think we're going to see a lot more of this where they're trying to ease the BLM movement over to the pro-police side a little bit more.
It also further reflects what you said a while back in a previous episode where you talked about the difference between like the Capitol Police and how they handled protesters and then how the Metropolitan Police, they're the ones like that's the officer who shot and murdered Ashley Babbitt. They look at these people like they're aliens, like they're foreigners.
Right. The MPD officers are probably going to be a lot more apt to mirror the politics of Washington D.C. Mm-hmm. But I don't think with Officer Hodges, I don't think that was the case. It really does look scripted, as if this is
talking points.
Right, talking points made. This is propaganda made for television. And because, like I said, the BLM movement is going to be a problem if it keeps going under a Biden administration.
I want to go back to the thing on Twitter. So I mentioned I was banned from Twitter. The last tweet that I ever liked before I was banned was this glorious tweet that started off this amazing thread. I've got to read this to you guys. This is from a Twitter account on Twitter right now at Bull Moose BU, Baylor Bull Moose Society. By unanimous consent of the board of Baylor Young Americans for Freedom, we hereby disassociate ourselves with Young Americans for Freedom and will now be known as the Baylor Bull Moose Society. When this chapter began, it was intended to be a place where conservatives could learn about and express ideas that serve to further the common good of the American people. In light of recent acts of aggression against our chapter, it has become clear that YAF has no tolerance for conservatives concerned with the furtherance of the common good. Our goal is to promote conservative ideas which aid the American worker, preserve and promote the American family, uplift the poor and downtrodden, and ensure that Americans of traditional Christian faith can freely serve God. We have no interest in promoting a corporatist conservatism which is chiefly concerned with protecting the interests of wealthy progressives intent on destroying this sacred American way of life. In this period of unprecedented agglomeration of corporate power, YAF has decided to advocate for the protection of said power and profits to the detriment of working Americans and the common good of our polity. Any conservatives who dares to object is attacked and ostracized. The future does not belong to those who cling to the dead consensus. We will not return to free trade absolutism, unrestricted immigration, and endless foreign wars. We will not return to a corporatist conservatism which openly disdains those it relies on for power. The future belongs to those conservatives who understand that the chief aim of our movement ought to be the preservation and promotion of the liberty and welfare of everyday Americans. We do not despise markets. It is merely our aim to preserve the God-given rights of the American people against monopolistic encroachments against their dignity and liberty. As President Theodore Roosevelt, the original Bull Moose, said, "Our aim is not to do away with corporations. We are merely determined that they shall be so handled as to subserve the public good. We draw the line against misconduct, not against wealth." We wish the like-minded patriots and other YAF chapters across the country the best of luck in working to change the culture of YAF from the ground up to fight for these values. If that endeavor fails, I encourage like-minded chapters to follow our lead, disassociate, and become independent organizations. Perhaps then YAF will realize that young Americans have no interest in preserving the dead consensus. Wow, this really is something, and I have a lot of stake in this particular battle here, a lot of experience rather, and Jacob, you do as well to a certain extent. We both have histories with Young Americans for Freedom, the Young Americas Foundation. Young Americans for Freedom is the student group that was founded in the 1960s in the home of William F. Buckley, and first got its start working for Barry Goldwater's campaign, and then subsequently morphed into a broader, like, conservative student group. And then Young America's Foundation was founded at the end of the 1960s and acquired Young Americans for Freedom. So they both have the acronym of YAF. Young Americans for Freedom is essentially the student outreach group, and YAF Foundation is the actual foundation that collects donations and stuff like that. So I interned for YAF back in college. I went to Santa Barbara, where, of course, in Santa Barbara, they have their Ronald Reagan Ranch Center, which is their West Coast headquarters, one of their two national headquarters, a 3-story museum to Ronald Reagan's Rancho del Cielo, which is his ranch up in the mountains above Santa Barbara. And I interned there in the last 2 years of my time in college. And I'd previously attended their conferences as a high school student, senior year of high school in 2013, and that was when I first found out who Ben Shapiro was. The thing with YAF these days, they're a conservative student group as a sort of rival to College Republicans and Young Americans for Liberty, and now Turning Point USA. And their big thing is they really, 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 really love to talk about Ronald Reagan.
It's basically, I think you described it one time as a Ronald Reagan fan club.
I said
that's a very apt description of it, because anytime I went to their conferences whenever I was in college, they couldn't stop singing the praises of Ronald Reagan. It was basically like the Church of Ronald Reagan.
I like to say the long-form description is it is the Church of Ronald Reagan with William Buckley as its prophet and Ben Shapiro as its high priest.
Yeah, that's an apt description.
That is all you need to know. Look, and they put on great conferences, and they did bring other really good speakers. That same high school college conference I went to when I first found out about them in 2013, our keynote speaker for the opening dinner the first night was Tom Tancredo, who was one of the most based congressmen in the history of the United States. He basically was kind of like the original Steve King, congressman from Colorado. Great guy. So they have had good speakers. But the problem is, I remember certainly during the election, because again, I was in college during the election. I was working at YAF at that ranch center the day of the election, 2016. Everybody I talked to there, certainly openly at the institutional level, like outwardly, and then privately, they were all anti-Trump. They did not dig anything that Trump was putting down. They were part of, because again, Ben Shapiro was one of the leading figures in that Never Trump push, like that National Review issue. They never liked Trump. And even after he became president, even when others like the Heritage Foundation and other big conservative organizations got behind him completely, rightfully so, YAF never really liked him. And I never understood why for the longest time. But it finally occurred to me. And this is the main reason I ultimately had to kind of break away from YAF, because I met quite a few people there, and I will not say that it was completely wasted. I enjoyed interning there. It was a great time. But the fact that they took such a stance as to not openly support Trump in such a crucial election, they basically followed Ben Shapiro's lead. And Ben Shapiro, of course, famously said the day of the election, folks, there's really no difference between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton, folks. They're basically the same people, folks, okay? There really is nothing different between the two of them. You might as well just not vote for either of them. They're both crap. So
there was one YAF conference in the fall of 2016, right before the general election, and you could tell the mood was such that everyone there believed that Trump was going to lose, Hillary Clinton was going to become president, and they would have to find a way to rebuild conservatism during the Clinton administration. And Dinesh D'Souza was he was the keynote speaker, and he was trying to encourage everyone to get on the Trump train, trying to encourage them that, yes, it's true, Trump isn't exactly a conservative like we think of being of a conservative, but he can move the ball forward as far as conservative policies go. But everyone there was just kind of shaking their heads like, no, his constituency is completely different from the constituency that Republicans traditionally go for. And I even talked to a friend of mine who was there with me. I said, well, shouldn't Republicans be trying to reach out to these blue-collar workers and try to bring them into the party, try to expand the party's base? And it wasn't really clicking. They were so scared that bringing in former Democrats, like Union Democrats, was going to change the makeup of the party, going to change the ideology of the party. And I'm like, well, do you want to keep the ideology the same and lose elections, or would you rather maybe tweak around the edges a little bit and actually win elections? But yeah, YAF was always they were very, for the most part, anti-Trump. They weren't very overt in it, especially after he became the nominee, but they were extremely
From what I saw,
disappointed in the fact that Trump became the nominee.
Yeah, and it occurred to me, too, I mean, talking to a few friends, it ultimately did occur to me what the real issue is there for the main thing. Like I said, they're a Ronald Reagan fan club. And again, Ronald Reagan's fine. You can like Ronald Reagan. He was a good president. But as one friend of mine said to me, said it very well, they're chasing Ronald Reagan's ghost.
Correct.
And sure, you can talk about how great he was and how funny he was an actor, how good-looking he was for a man as old as he was. But Ronald Reagan is gone, man. He left office 30 years ago. He died, 15, 16, going on 17 years ago now. You cannot just keep talking about how great Ronald Reagan was any more than you can talk about how great Calvin Coolidge was. Like, you've got to move on.
Right. Ronald Reagan was a big fan of Calvin Coolidge. In fact, he tried to model a lot of his presidency off of Coolidge, but he didn't try to become the Coolidge 2.0. Like, he was his own man. Mm-hmm. But you mentioned the Baylor student group. They attacked the corporate interest of the Republican Party. How the YAF is mainly what was the wording they used to attack the
quote, a corporatist conservatism which is chiefly concerned with protecting the interests of wealthy progressives intent on destroying the sacred American way of life.
So this is what Robert Verbruggen, I guess that's how you pronounce his name, with National Review just wrote about some of the regulations that Trump wants to place on banks. He writes, quote, conservatives are getting a little fed up with big business. Tech overlords are at the top of the you-know-what list, especially after they work together to kick out our deranged president off the major social media sites and sideline the fringe alternative parlay. Okay, next paragraph. We on the right do need to rethink our relationships with huge corporations that hate us even after all those sweet tax cuts we gave them, but we need to do so carefully, especially when making government policies that could fail, backfire, or violate basic conservative principles in the name of knocking liberals down a peg. And this kind of plays to, they're wedded to an ideology. They're wedded to the Reagan ideology. And if it means losing to maintain the purity of that ideology, they're willing to lose. And they're not willing to implement a little bit of regulation. And look, I guarantee you, if I asked Mr. Verbruggen if he agrees with the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which mandates that businesses serve anyone regardless of the color of their skin and forbids them from discriminating based on the color of their skin, I guarantee you he would say that he supports that wholeheartedly, and he would viciously attack anyone who criticizes that, including Rand Paul.
Rand Paul, exactly.
But yet here he is, he's fallen all over himself, is basically telling conservatives we got to hold the line when it comes to deregulation, when it comes to our positions and our principles, our values on the pro-corporate policy that we've maintained in the Republican Party. And look, I'm sorry, that's just not where Republican voters are.
Nope, not anymore.
You have chosen the middle class, the suburban middle class has become so secularized and so socially liberal that they want nothing to do with the Republican Party. The Republican Party is the working class, the working men and women of this country, the people who make, I don't know, between $20,000 and $150,000 a year. They are the backbone of the Republican Party. And as long as you're going to continue to treat the people who make $500,000 to $2 million a year, $500,000 to $2 million a year as the backbone of your party, you're going to continue to miss these voters who are showing up, supporting you time and time again.
And the fact that the Baylor Bull Moose Society felt the need to disassociate like this shows that YAF, especially now that Trump has lost, they haven't learned anything. They seem to think, oh, this was a rejection of Donald Trump. And finally, that solidified it to me, the main reason why, the flaw with why they love Reagan so much. First off, they look at Reagan's ideology through the lens of the time he was president, a.k.a. the Cold War tunnel vision. And to me, I've always said that was one of the main problems with modern conservatism, especially the Republican Party's reluctance to support Trump, is they view everything through the Cold War lens, namely Ronald Reagan. And of course, Ronald Reagan was a fantastic president for the Cold War. He was exactly what we needed to fight and win the Cold War. So free markets, being against tariffs, because tariffs are a form of government intervention. I've always said this. For 50 years, we needed to be the exact opposite of those dirty commies, right? They're communists. We have to be as free market capitalist as possible. Complete free markets. No form of government intervention. Government intervention is the problem. Government intervention is basically communism. Okay, well, the Cold War's over now, so how about it's time that we maybe look at some problems with our own capitalist system? And not saying replace it, but there are issues, like the free market certainly led to the rise of big tech and these corporate monopolies and these woke corporations. And these people, these Paul Ryan types will say, no, Ben Shapiro, no, just let the free market do its thing, folks. Just let the free market do its thing and everything will work out, folks.
Well, what's happening is you're having these corporations that are essentially becoming cartels, and they're becoming more powerful than the government. They now have the power to take someone's livelihood away from them. They have the power to kill business. We see this with Parlay. These businesses, these major multinational corporations can team up. And if your CEO says something that's problematic, they can kill your business. They can take away your livelihood. They can put all your employees out of work. And this is something that didn't exist back in the 80s. This is something that Reagan never encountered. So, okay, you can look at Reagan's presidency in the 80s and say, okay, it worked then. It was good policy then. But our foreign policy position is different. We don't have another superpower staring down our throats. Now we're going to with China if we don't change, if we don't move in a more economically nationalistic direction. And just an example, I saw, Biden won those Senate races in Georgia by going down there and campaigning on $2,000 checks to every single American. That was why people showed up in Georgia and voted. It sure that Hollywood, all the billions of dollars that Hollywood poured into that state helped, but the $2,000 a month was huge, and that's not a conservative position. It's not a conservative position to give people $2,000 a month. But in a time of a pandemic like this, when we shut down businesses, when states have shut down businesses, they locked everyone in their homes for close to 2 months. People couldn't work. They couldn't earn a living. And then they gave them $1,200. Okay, $1,200 isn't going to do much for you. But that's why those Democrats won. And what's interesting is I noticed Biden is already backing off on his $2,000 plan. He's wanting to only give $1,400 under the excuse that, well, if you take the $600 that was already given, if you add $600 to $1,400, that'll end up being $2,000. That's plenty for the plebs. That's the plebs are fine with that.
Yeah, and that was a jab at the earlier $600 handout. Like, oh, this is $600 less than $2,000. Like, no, we wanted $2,000. What are you doing, man? Like, this is ridiculous. I just can't believe it. But at the end of the day, too, it's funny you mentioned, China. We are facing down China as the new world power. And I'm pretty sure there was a guy who has been consistently predicting the rise of China repeatedly since the 1980s. What was his name? I think his name was Donald Trump. Yeah. And yet you conservatives who just couldn't help yourselves with this principle nonsense of, oh, this is not what Ronald Reagan would want. This is beneath us. We shouldn't do this because it sets a bad precedent. Yeah, good job, guys. Now look where we are. So at the end of the day, you can talk about former presidents all you want and your ideals about, conservatism. I remember, too, that was one thing YAF did, was they always said, what are the three basic principles of conservatism? They always said individual liberty, free markets, and a strong national defense. You notice how open-ended a couple of those are? Certainly free markets, don't let the government get involved. But strong national defense, how that kind of leaves a little bit of an opening for the neocons to justify strong national defense as, oh, clearly we need to go smash a couple of Middle Eastern governments.
Well, it's a holdover from the Cold War. During the Reagan era, a strong national defense was the conservative position. That kind of started with Goldwater, because during the Goldwater era, the Democrats did want to cut defense spending. But it was weird when you're in a Cold War with a superpower, you kind of have to have a strong national defense to make sure that you prevent their wanting to attack you. Once the Soviet Union was destroyed, though, having a strong national defense really isn't a conservative position anymore. It then goes back to the default Wilsonian position, which was a liberal position. I mean, Woodrow Wilson and the Democrats, if starting in the 19-teens, moving into the 20s and 30s, they were the ones who were the militarists. They wanted to build up the military. Republicans wanted to focus on Americans at home. Well, once the Cold War was over, that kind of ceased to be a conservative position.
Exactly. And that just further reiterates to me how outdated the Cold War conservatism, which is essentially fusionism, which is the term for the alliance formed between the neocons and the libertarians, which that's got to be one of the biggest political mistakes in modern American history. Two cancerous ideologies like neoconservatism and libertarianism joining forces, nothing good is ever going to come out of that. And the one last thing, too, I realized about why these people love Ronald Reagan so much, they don't even really love Ronald Reagan. Back in 1980, at the time Reagan was, because remember, Reagan dared to challenge Gerald Ford as the incumbent president in 76. The Republican establishment hated Reagan. They wanted Bush. If Twitter existed in 1980, there absolutely would have been a hashtag Never Reagan movement, and it would have been led by the same people today who bash Trump in the name of Ronald Reagan. But you know why they worship Ronald Reagan and why they insist he was the second coming of Christ as far as Republicans are concerned? They love his electoral results. He crushed Jimmy Carter with 44 states in 1980, and then he won the biggest landslide in American history with 49 out of 50 states in 84 against Mondale, and lost the one state of Minnesota by 3,000 votes. So he basically came closer than anyone else to winning all 50 states. That's what they want. They want someone else who can win 40-plus states. But the sad reality is that's not going to happen anymore. This is a different country from 1980 and 1984. You notice each electoral result has been gradually going down since then. Bush Sr. in 88 did not do as well as Reagan in 84. Clinton both times did not do as well as Bush Sr. Bush Jr. obviously did very poorly, both very narrow results. Obama did well, but even then, neither of his election victories were quite as big as Clinton's were. And then Trump and Biden both come along, and their results are ultimately smaller than Obama's. The exact same electoral results, except flipped, supposedly.
Yeah, we're too divided as a country to ever have a president win by those margins again. I mean, unless I will say though, if in the direction that the Republican Party is going, it wouldn't surprise me if in 2024 or 2028 Democrats wipe the board the way Reagan wiped the board. If the Republican Party doesn't change, conservatives and Trump Republicans are just going to stay home. They're not going to. I mean, it's going to be Georgia in every state. They're just going to decide to stay home, and that's what I don't really know if Republicans have quite got it through their heads yet why they lost Georgia. They lost Georgia because millennial and Gen Z Republicans stayed home. They didn't vote. If you look at the votes that Trump got in November and compare that with what Loeffler and Perdue got, there's millions of votes in difference. And so that's because younger Republicans did not vote. They're like, okay, look, Republicans aren't going to do anything for us. Why should we do anything for them?
And especially considering Trump, too, is historic. He repeatedly smashed records. In 2016, he got elected with 62.9 million votes, which was the record for a Republican presidential candidate. He beat Bush Jr., who got 60 million in 2004. Then this time around, he increases his total by 11 million for 74.2 million, which is the new record for a Republican candidate, and certainly the record for an incumbent president, and one of the largest increases ever for an incumbent president in their reelection. Donald Trump did that, barely lost those key states, and smashed Republican popular vote records. You really think in 2024, let's say Ted Cruz, you really think Cruz could even break 70 million votes? I doubt it.
Well, it depends on whether or not Republicans start to fear their own voters more than they fear the media. And we got a perfect example of that this past week after the media started demanding that President Trump the media in working with the Democrats in Congress, with Nancy Pelosi and the House Democrats, started demanding that Trump be impeached a second time. And,
impeached or removed via the 25th, which Pence wouldn't do, so they went with impeachment.
They went with impeachment. But, in normal times, you had 10 Republicans that crossed over and voted for impeachment. In normal times, if something like this happened, it would have been the other way. You would have had 10 Democrats cross over and vote against impeachment for the speech that Trump gave.
Exactly. They couldn't do anything about coronavirus stimulus for 6 months, but they rushed out impeachment in literally less than a week, because that's just how Congress with a 13% approval rating works. And we are going to name names. We're going to go ahead and give you the names so that you can have this handy. Here are the 10 traitors who voted to impeach Donald Trump. Jamie Butler, Washington District 3. Liz Cheney, Wyoming at large, chair of the House GOP caucus, which is the third most senior-most position in the House Republicans. Anthony Gonzalez, Ohio 16. John Katko, New York 24. Adam Kinzinger, no surprise there, Illinois 16. Peter Mayer, Michigan 3. That's the guy who replaced Justin Amash, so we swapped out one cuck for another. Good job, Michigan. Dan Newhouse, Washington 4. Tom Rice, South Carolina 7. Fred Upton, Michigan 6. And, this one hurts my heart. This was my former congressman, David Valadao, California 21. I'm just going to go right off, and full disclosure, everything about Valadao. I volunteered for him way back in 2012. Was it when I was still in high school? I volunteered for his then election campaign. He was a state assemblyman who had served one term, and he ran for Congress, the 21st District, which is a heavily Latino district. It's like 70% Latino and like D plus 15. It's a very blue district, right? And he ran as a Republican, and he managed to get about 60% of the vote in the general election. And he was reelected in 2014 and 2016 by similar margins. So clearly doing something very, very right. He's a dairy farmer before he was in politics. So just a working class guy, a citizen politician, as it were. And then in 2018, after California had fully legalized ballot harvesting and gave it to, they literally had nobody else. They got this absolute loser named TJ Cox, who is from Maryland, by the way. He literally moved to California a few months before the primary just to run in this district, because that's how California laws are. You can harvest ballots, you can run for Congress even though you're not from the state. He literally could not even vote for himself for Congress because he wasn't a registered resident of the state. But this guy, who certainly being a carpetbagger didn't help him, but he also had a lot of scandals during his 2 years, tax fraud and financial misdeeds at his various businesses. He was very corrupt and incompetent and uncharismatic, just most unlikable person you could possibly find. So then Valadao comes back to win his old seat again in 2020, and he wins by about 1,200 votes because the Republicans did kind of implement their own ballot harvesting scheme. They figured, well, it's the law in the state, we might as well use it. So by 1,200 votes, which is not a very big margin. It still is. It's certainly not the 60% margins he's used to. So for him to do this was his first vote as a newly reelected member of Congress, by the way. His swearing in was delayed because of COVID stuff, and this is his first vote. He walks back into Congress, vote to impeach Donald Trump. And I've talked to so many family and friends back home who are livid. I mean, furious with this guy, as I am. I have said if I could still vote back there, I would vote for the Democrat who runs against him next time around.
Well,
and so many people agree with me.
That's what will have to happen in 2022. And here's the way that Republicans are going to have to do this going forward. So Republicans are outgunned in the media 10-1. Trump Republicans are outgunned in the media like 100-1.
That's being generous.
That's being generous. For Trump Republicans really don't have anything to fight back with except their vote. So until Trump Republicans are willing to start crossing over and voting for Democrats in the general election, they're not going to have a voice in the Republican Party. The Republican Party is going to be effectively bulldoze Trumpism out of the Republican Party unless Trump voters are willing to withhold their votes from Republicans. In 2022, all 10 of these Republicans will need to be primaried.
And if not primaried, then vote for the Democrat over them.
Correct. Well, if they win their primary, and the only way they would be able to win their primary is if they manage to
split the field, multiple challengers.
They recruited major Wall Street donors and just poured hundreds of millions of dollars into their races. But they will, and I'm sure all 10 of them will be primaried. If they manage to buy the primary, Trump Republicans need to vote en masse for the Democrat in the general election. And they need to make it clear ahead of time that that's what they're going to do. So these 10 members of Congress will understand they're going to have to step down by 2022. They will not be in Congress in 2023. Either they're going to be defeated in the primary or they're going to be defeated by the Democrat in the general election because Trump voters are going to cross over and vote for the Democrat. It's not enough to stay home anymore.
Exactly. I had to tell so many family and friends that. They said, I just won't vote. And I said, no. The best way to hurt him is not to not vote because that subtracts one vote from your congressman and then it's done. If you vote for the Democrat, that takes away one vote for them and gives it to the Democrat. It's basic math. So these people have to go. And especially, of course, you guys have probably all heard the media coverage. Liz Cheney was the one who spearheaded this effort. Number 3 Republican in the House. And yes, the Cheney of that Cheney infamy. And National Review, it's funny you cited National Review earlier in this episode. National Review sung her praises with a piece by the editors describing profiles in courage. Republicans need more people like Liz Cheney. I'm like, yeah, isn't that exactly why you guys lost in 2008? I mean, Obama was going to win no matter what, but wasn't one of his big things campaigning against the endless Bush wars that Bush started at Bush, or realistically, that Cheney started? I guarantee you, Liz, with so many of these people, it's the easiest thing. Occam's razor, I believe, is the rule that, just the simplest explanation is probably the correct one. It's ego. And like so many people, Anthony Scaramucci, Chris Christie, certainly most of the Never Trumpers, the Bill Kristol Bulwark, Lincoln Project types, Liz Cheney is just like them. Her ego was hurt that Trump came along and dared to be a Republican candidate who criticized Daddy's wars. He criticized Bush, he criticized Cheney, he criticized these wars, and she couldn't handle that. She probably went into the cast that vote thinking, only Democrats are allowed to call my dad a war criminal. Unacceptable from a Republican.
Well, also, it doesn't take a lot of courage to vote for impeachment for Trump when the media is, unanimous calling for his head practically. How does that require courage? It doesn't require. I mean, every single media outlet is calling for his impeachment. Fox News abandoned him a long time ago. He has no support in the media, academia. Big businesses turned against him long ago and supported Joe Biden. Everyone in authority, all the institutions are calling for his impeachment. And you're going to say it's courageous for her to vote for impeachment? I mean,
it's the same mindset as the Antifa BLM crowd that literally thinks they're starting a revolution when every major corporation in the world and the mainstream media and Hollywood and big tech and one of the 2 major parties in the country are all on their side. Like Target and Walmart tweeting out Black Power Fist, # Black Lives Matter. Oh, we're oppressed. We're the revolution. We're the minority, guys. Yeah, okay. All right. And they do it in such minimal reward. They get maybe 5 minutes of praise from the mainstream media. There's little collages being shared by lefties on Twitter saying, oh, these 10 brave Republicans who stood up to Trump. And then what's the cons from that? Again, like my congressman, Valadao, I can guarantee you, his being an agricultural district, yes, it's 70% Latino and it's 15 points Democrat, but the leftist, it's certainly not a lefty district. You're not going to find any BLM or Antifa marches in this district. They're mostly farmers or farm workers. They could care less about whether or not Trump gets impeached. I don't imagine there are plenty of Democratic voters in that district who will say, oh, he didn't vote to impeach Trump, we're not going to vote for him. I guarantee you, though, there are certainly way more than 1,200 Trump-supporting Republicans in that district who are going to say, yeah, he voted to impeach Trump. Nothing else matters. We're not going to vote for him. At the end of the day, you can appeal to moderates and independents all you want, but at the end of the day, you need your base. If you do not have Republican voters to back you, first and foremost, as a Republican, you're not going to win. Sorry, guys, it's basic political math.
And one of the things that Republicans have done in the past, whenever you have a Republican that's more afraid of the media than they're afraid of the voters, is they'll criticize them at the beginning, and then whenever election time comes around, the big scare that Republicans always use to bring the base home is the fear of socialism. Once the general election comes around, it's like, well, this candidate voted against your interests and against the will of the people who elected him the first time around. But if you elect the Democrat is going to help usher in socialism to America. That doesn't work anymore. And Georgia showed that. People
again, the Cold War is over, guys. It's not a big boogeyman anymore.
Exactly. People are not scared of socialism anymore. And besides, the Democrats aren't socialists. This is something that Republicans a lot of Republicans at least can't seem to get through their heads. The Democrats are not a socialist party. They're a corporatist party. They're supported by all the major corporations. Do you really think Wall Street is going to throw 90% of its support behind Democrats if Democrats were the party of socialism? Those corporations don't support socialism. So the socialist boogeyman isn't going to work in 2022. When you have Liz Cheney versus a Democrat, it's a red district, but those Trump Republicans are going to be so pissed off at her, I guarantee you, and with a little bit of help too from people from around the country, I guarantee you those Trump Republicans are going to show up in mass and they're going to vote for the Democrat, and they're going to turn Liz Cheney out of office. And this is what we saw a lot in 2018. A lot of never Trump Republicans in Congress, they retired.
Yep, because they knew what was coming.
They knew what was coming. They knew they were going to get turned out of office. They knew they had no chance. If they lost the primary, they were going to lose the general election because Trump voters would not show up and would not vote for them. And hopefully all 10 of these understand that they have 2 years left in Congress, and then they're going to need to go find something else to do with their life.
Exactly. But knowing at least that they got to contribute to something that actually really is responsible for the breakdown of our democracy, or the breakdown of precedent or norms, terms they love to use. Impeachment used to be something that was reserved literally for the most egregious crimes. Andrew Johnson unconstitutionally tried to fire one of his cabinet officials. Bill Clinton committed perjury. Richard Nixon, had he been impeached, would have, obviously abused the office of the presidency to spy on his political opponents, which, again, pretty much every president has done that ever. Nixon was just the first one to get caught. But it's been said, there are only 4 impeachments now in the history of the United States. 2 of them just happened within the span of 1 year against the same guy. Impeachment is now literally a political football. Democrats were even talking about impeaching Bush back in the day. I'm old enough to remember that. They were getting ready to impeach him.
Anymore.
No.
It's like Trump got impeached again. Okay, what else is new? It's
whatever.
Like, whatever.
It's literally, and I would say political football, but that's technically not correct because that would involve both sides utilizing it. And the sad thing is, especially coming away from this, Republicans will never have the guts to impeach Joe Biden. Not in a million years. And if they try to, you're not going to see a single Democrat vote to impeach Joe Biden. Certainly, you're going to see people start to introduce measures. One example, of course, is Marjorie Taylor Greene, that based alleged QAnon supporter in Congress, although she's denied this, elected in Georgia, who has announced that she will file articles of impeachment against then President Joe Biden the day after he is sworn in. And for her troubles, she did apparently get banned on Twitter. She got a 12-hour temporary suspension. So, yeah, they did it to Trump. They can do it to anybody. So, but we'll see what happens. So that just further reflects that the Republicans have not learned anything from 4 years of Trump. And all they can do is spit in their voters' faces and insist, the one guy who actually came closer than anything else to making the Republican Party viable again, no, clearly he was a mistake because he didn't get reelected. Yeah, he still got elected the first time, which is more than can be said for any of these other people who were running in 2016. Rubio, Cruz, Ben Carson, as much as I like him, none of them were going to beat Hillary. Only Trump could have done that, but they'd rather... Again, going back to the YAF thing, they'd rather go back to talking about Ronald Reagan. They'd rather go back to a conservative ideology that is outdated because the Cold War is not a thing anymore. They'd rather keep living in the past. This is something another friend of mine said to me when I was talking about the problems with the YAF. They are curators of the past. The Republican establishment, the donor class certainly, they have all their money. They get their money from donors, or they're the donors themselves who are already rich, and they couldn't care less about what happens because they are secure financially. They have their positions, and they're not going anywhere. They could care less about the working class, like you said. They only care about securing themselves, and that's all that matters to them because they're individualists and because they're capitalists, right? So it's just a disaster. And this is why I do embrace, at this point, burning the Republican Party to the ground, even irrespective of what happens in the Senate. Certainly, if the Senate does vote to impeach, actually convict Trump, then just nuke the Republican Party. The Republican Party needs to be Hiroshima, and we need to drop the fat boy on it, all right? Just destroy the Republican Party forever, because at that point, it will be worthless. And we'll already basically be under one-party Democrat rule at that point. We might as well end the facade.
Right. Exactly. If we're just going to be ruled by Democrats, let's go ahead and elect Democrats. Let's stop having Republicans in name only in Congress. And what's dangerous about this impeachment vote is you look at these 10 Republicans who voted for impeachment, even though I guarantee you the majority of the people in each one of those districts do not support impeachment. If they're able to get away with that, with no consequences from their voters, if without being turned out in 2022, they can vote for anything else. Joe Biden is wanting to give amnesty to 11 million illegal immigrants in the United States. They're going to bring that up for a vote within the next few weeks. I'm wondering, are these Republicans going to vote for amnesty? Because apparently
Valadeo will, I can guarantee it.
Well, apparently they're susceptible to the media, to media bullying. And basically this is just media bullying. The media demands that they do something, and to avoid the negative press, to avoid the constant onslaught of negative article after negative article of constant protest in front of their house, constant harassment, they just give in. They just figure, okay, well, I'm just going to vote for amnesty. They'll try to rationalize it some way. I remember during the Black Lives Matter, the height of the Black Lives Matter movement in June, you actually had some Republicans on Twitter comment, we need to try to come up with a conservative way to give reparations to the descendants of slaves in America. It's like, okay, there is no conservative position on that. That's not a conservative position. Same way with amnesty to illegal immigrants. There is no conservative position on that. I mean, you can use it as a bargaining chip to some extent. Maybe you can give partial amnesty in exchange for cutting down legal immigration. Let's say end chain migration, end the visa lottery in exchange for partial. There's certain you could do some horse trading, but the problem is these Republicans, they wouldn't even do that because the media would then claim, well, they're holding hostage millions of hardworking people who are in this country trying to provide for their families over wanting to limit non-white people from coming into America. That's the line the media would use, and they would cave to it. So, look, the only way Republicans have to whip these people into shape is to vote for the Democrats in the general election. If your Republican congressman is not going to do what you want them to do, primary him. If you lose the primary, show up and vote for the Democrat.
Yeah, and on top of it, certainly amnesty is the worst thing, but even the other things too, like you mentioned before, Biden's stimulus plan, $1.9 trillion, $1,400 checks for Americans. And this is something that has not been reported nearly enough. I didn't even know this until you told me about it. That plan includes raising the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour.
That's a poison pill if I've ever heard of one.
Talk about economic suicide. I mean, for God's sakes, do these people not understand the meaning of the word inflation? For one, I mean, we've been over this a million times over. Why $15 an hour doesn't work. It will certainly, with the rise of China economically, especially the one thing China would love right about now, other than a civil war here in the United States, is the collapse of the American dollar. And that's exactly what is going to happen under $15 an hour minimum wage. So yeah, the Democrats, like you said, the Democrats aren't socialist. Reminder that they had an actual socialist who was about to become the nominee, and they went out of their way to rig it against him to stop him, that being Bernie. But they are still going to go out of their way to do things that are economically harmful, even if it is not by definition socialism. $15 an hour minimum wage. Biden said he's going to rejoin the Paris Accord. He's going to cancel the Keystone XL pipeline on day one, which is going to hurt our energy independence efforts.
But see, and that's another thing. I'm wondering, are these Republicans going to actually hold the line and vote against the stimulus package? Because certainly I support $2,000 checks. I mean, I want them to actually give $2,000 checks and not just top off the $600 they gave earlier to equal $2,000. But if you're a Republican, you can't vote for this if it includes a $15 minimum wage. The reason why Democrats support a $15 minimum wage is because that would do minimal harm to the areas where they're based in. So they passed a $15 minimum wage in Seattle, and it hurt the economy a little bit, hurt poor people a little bit, but it wasn't devastating just because the cost of living is so high. So there weren't many people that were making below $15 an hour to begin with. In D.C., they're moving up to a $15 minimum wage. They were gradually going up. I don't know if they're there yet. They should be there next year if they're not there yet. But what happened is all the McDonald's closed. They cut their workforce, and they all implemented the automatic the kiosks. They all put in the automatic kiosks.
Self-checkout. Yep.
Right,
you see those I see those at grocery stores. You see those at Walmarts and Targets.
So you're just, when you raise the minimum wage like that, you're hurting poor people. They claim, Democrats claim to want to help poor people. Well, how is putting poor people on the streets and putting them out of a job exactly going to help them? And what's interesting is Germany did not have a minimum wage until 2015. I believe it was 2015. It was sometime in the mid-2010s. But this country of Germany never had a minimum wage before that, and they've always been one of the economic powerhouses of the world. You don't have to have a minimum wage to have a prosperous economy. In fact, I would argue you're best off if you don't have a minimum wage, because it's not wage slavery when people are willingly signing up for a job to work. People say, well, we want people to make a living wage. Well, if you raise the minimum wage, if raising the minimum wage actually works, then why stop at $15 an hour? Why not
go to $100 an hour?
Right,
Shouldn't that solve everyone's problems?
Let's all make at least $1,000 an hour. Wouldn't that be? I mean, if you want to really raise people's standard of living, why stop at 15? What's so magical about 15? What about 18, 20, 25? So it doesn't. They don't understand how the economy works. They want their constituents who make $12 and $13 an hour to make a little bit more so they can get their votes, and that's what it amounts to.
That feeling when Germany is ahead of the curve, ahead of you on anything, feels bad, man. And yeah, like you said, it's not just putting workers out of work because, the employers can't pay those wages, so they fire people and they get the kiosks. Then the prices of everything goes up. Prices of goods, prices of food goes up to accommodate $15 an hour. So then people cannot afford to buy these things to feed their family, to sustain themselves, and it gets worse there as well. So it's hurting so many people.
But this accomplishes something else for Democrats. The same thing that locking down small businesses accomplishes for Democrats. It eliminates the self-sustainable middle class.
The small businesses.
Small business owners aren't going to be able to see these big corporations. They're going to be able to afford to automate. They're going to be able to bring in automated kiosks. They're going to be able to scale their production to be able to cut down on their workforce to be able to survive. The small business doesn't have that kind of capital. The small business is going to have to fold. And that small businessman who makes $70,000 a year, he's going to have to say, you know what, I can't afford to pay my employees $15 an hour, and even if I cut back on my workforce, I'm still not going to come out on top. I'm just going to go close my business, and I'll go work as a manager at Target, and I can go make $70,000 at Target. I might even be able to make a little bit more as a manager, and so it's going to completely wipe out these small businesses and all the employees that they employed, because now those employees, they can't go get a job at Target because Target has already been cutting their workforce because they had to raise their minimum wage. But it's just all around. It's economic disaster.
Absolute disaster. It's going to turn us into a real corporatist economy because not only are the business owners going to leave and go work for a corporation, but they say they close up shop, they close up the building where, say, the diner is located. What's going to move in and take the space in that diner?
Dollar General.
A corporation. Yeah, exactly. A corporation. Just like with the lockdowns, just like with the riots, because the small businesses that were burned to the ground had no insurance. So a corporation comes in and buys that plot of land and cleans out the debris and builds a Safeway on the plot or something. I don't know.
I'll tell you, if things keep going this way, the anger toward corporations is going to make Occupy Wall Street look like a walk in the park.
Literally a walk in the park, minus the raping, I guess.
The corporations are going to dream of the days that they could go back to Zuccotti Park. They're going to be like, hey, could we go back to Occupy Wall Street? Because this is much, much worse.
Once again, one of my recurring themes for the year 2020 has been, as much as I despise the French Revolution, it was one of the biggest socio-political disasters in human history. Things that have taken place over the course of the year 2020 have helped me understand why the French Revolution happened. This is definitely setting up less 1776 and more 1789.
Yeah, because you had both sides of the political spectrum bringing in execution tools to Washington, D.C. During the Black Lives Matter protest, you had Antifa bringing in a guillotine to Washington, D.C., a makeshift guillotine. And now recently in the Capitol Hill riots, you had right-wingers bringing in a makeshift gallows to hang the politicians on. So, whatever you have left and right bringing in their execution devices of choice to the nation's capital, society is not healthy. This is not a healthy society when things start happening like that.
That's definitely another good way to summarize 2020. This is not sustainable, period. And that is why we are seeing these shifts. Going back to the YAF thing, to the Baylor U thing, these are shifts that are being talked about in the Republican Party absolutely have to happen in order to counter what the Democrats are doing, what the Democrats are going to shift to under the next 4 years, or else the Republican Party will go into total extinction, and then sooner or later, an actual socialist will be elected instead of a corporatist puppet like Joe Biden. Man, this is going to be a very long... Are we taking bets, Jacob? Is it going to be a long 4 years or a long 8 years? Which one is it going to be, man?
It all depends on the Republican Party. If the Republican Party starts to fear their voters more than they fear the media, this is going to be a very short 4 years, and we're going to come out on top in 2024. If the Republican Party continues to fear the media more than they fear the voters, it's going to be a very long 8 years, and we will have entered you'll basically see the Californication of America, in which you have the ultra-rich, the ultra-poor, and no middle class.
As a former lifelong California resident, I can attest to the absolute disaster that is the People's Republic of California. And God willing, we will not go down that path. And we here at The Right Take will do everything we can to prevent that from happening. So that is all the time that we have left for this episode of The Right Take. Tune in next week for the first episode of The Right Take to take place in a Biden presidency. Until next time, this has been The Right Take.